One goal of every process plant is to produce a quality product at the lowest possible cost. A valuable tool that can be used to help maintain consistent quality while keeping failure costs down is statistical process control, or SPC. In the process industry, quality generally means that the finished product consistently meets the requirements established for it. Maintaining quality and controlling costs affect every stage of a production process, from the initial formulation of the product through the packaging of the final product for shipment to the customer. One of the biggest costs that any process plant can encounter is the cost associated with producing defective product. This is commonly referred to as failure cost, and it includes the cost of replacing defective product, the cost of scrap material from the production process, the cost resulting from returned product, and the cost associated with lost sales and customers. Basically, statistical process control, or SPC, is a way of monitoring a process to maintain consistent quality and thereby reduce failure costs. It relies on using mathematical laws of statistical probability. These laws have to do with the probability of something occurring either naturally or because of an outside influence. In any process, there is always some amount of variation. Because of this natural variation, no product is exactly the same all the time. But if there's too much variation, there's a problem somewhere in the process. Too little variation may seem like a good thing, but statistically it shouldn't occur under normal circumstances. So too little variation could also indicate a problem in the process. SPC enables operators to determine how much and what kind of variation is occurring in a process. That way, they can take steps to eliminate any problems and maintain product quality. With SPC, information about the process is collected and plotted on control charts. These charts provide a visual representation of what's occurring in the process. They provide information that the operator can use to maintain product quality, and they can serve as a documentation of quality for the customer. SPC is based on the mathematical laws of statistical probability, and while these laws have been around for many years, SPC itself is relatively new. During the 1920s, various research groups in Europe and the United States became interested in applying statistical methods to the problems of industrial quality control. Extensive studies were carried out by a research team from the Bell Telephone Laboratories. Those studies focused on how often certain events occur under given circumstances. In 1924, a member of this team named Walter Shewhart came up with a way to determine mathematically boundaries of natural variation for a process. Shewhart developed a chart to display this variation. The chart, which became known as the Shewhart control chart, had limits for the amount of variation that should occur in a process. According to Shewhart, the natural variation that occurs in a process should almost always fall within the limits established for that process. If the variation exceeds the limits, there may be something wrong in the process. With his ideas on variation in a process and the development of the Shewhart control chart, Walter Shewhart essentially became the father of SPC. When World War II erupted, the need for better quality control became more apparent. While shifting from civilian goods to military goods, manufacturers had problems maintaining quality. During this period, the research that had been conducted at Bell Labs was applied with great success. Similar results occurred after the war. While shifting back to civilian goods, manufacturers faced many of the same types of problems they had encountered before. Again, SPC proved to be a big help. Interest in SPC was growing, but nowhere did it have an impact like it did in Japan. The Japanese economy had been virtually destroyed by the war. In an effort to help restore the Japanese economy, the United States sent a team of experts to Japan. Among them was a researcher from the Census Bureau named W. Edwards Deming. Deming was a strong supporter of SPC. He began teaching Japanese managers, engineers, and scientists how to use statistics to improve quality. Partly as a result of Deming's efforts, the Japanese economy became one of the strongest in the world. One of the biggest costs that any process plant can encounter is the cost associated with producing defective product. This is commonly referred to as failure cost, and it includes the cost of replacing defective product, the cost of scrap material from the production process, the cost resulting from returned product, and the cost associated with lost sales and customers. Basically, statistical process control, or SPC, is a way of monitoring a process to maintain consistent quality and thereby reduce failure costs. SPC is based on the mathematical laws of statistical probability, and while these laws have been around for many years, SPC itself is relatively new. A process is ordinarily thought of as a sequence of operations involved with producing a product from start to finish. But it's also possible to look at each step in the production of a product as being a process itself. In some situations, SPC is applied to the entire production process, while in other situations, it's used to monitor parts of the overall process. Regardless of what the process is, it can be influenced by many different factors. For example, it can be affected by people. One operator might do something differently from another, causing variation in the process. A process can also be affected by the material used. For example, changes in a raw material can cause changes in the process. Equipment can also affect a process. For example, when a pump or compressor malfunctions, variation can occur. Another factor that can affect a process is the environment. For example, an increase or a decrease in ambient temperature could affect the cooling capacity at a certain step in a process. The requirements of the end product can also affect a process. For example, if the requirements become more restrictive, it may become harder to produce a product that meets those requirements. Factors such as these account for the fact that there's always some variation in the final product. SPC takes into consideration that some variation will always occur in a process, and it breaks variation down into two categories: random or normal variation, and special or abnormal variation. Normal variation occurs randomly and naturally in a process. Abnormal variation is sometimes referred to as assignable variation, since it can be assigned to a specific cause or problem. With SPC, when only normal variation is present in a process, the process is considered to be in statistical control. But when there's abnormal variation present, the process may be unstable or it may be out of statistical control. To determine whether abnormal variation exists, information is collected from the process, plotted on control charts, and analyzed. The type of chart that's used will depend on the process being monitored. Operators typically don't choose the type of control chart, and they may not be involved in setting it up for a process. But it helps to be aware of some of the factors that go into applying SPC to a process. One factor that dictates the type of control chart used is whether the data collected from the process is variable data or attribute data. Variable data represents measurements taken from the process, such as temperature, pressure, pH, or weight. Attribute data is basically data that can be counted. Often, it's based on the number of items that fail to conform to some standard. An example of attribute data is the number of products that either pass or fail a standard test. Whether variable data or attribute data is collected from a process is one factor that affects which type of control chart is used to monitor the process. And determining which type of chart to use is one step in applying SPC. Another step involves calculating the proper control limits for the process being monitored. Control limits are boundaries within which the process is controlled. While operators typically do not calculate control limits, it's important to understand that the data that's collected from a process should fall within these limits. If it doesn't, there's a problem somewhere in the process. One step that operators may be involved in is collecting sample data from the process. The data that's collected may be used in a formula to determine the values to be plotted on the control charts. After the appropriate values are plotted, the charts can be analyzed to determine if a problem exists within the process. A control chart alone will not tell you the cause of the problem. To determine that, you'll need to do some additional investigating. One thing that can be done to help identify the causes of problems is to keep a written log describing events that occur in the process. By comparing information in the log with the information on the control charts, it's often possible to isolate the cause of a problem. Corrective action can then be taken. Regardless of what the process is, it can be influenced by many different factors. For example, it can be affected by people. One operator might do something differently from another, causing variation in the process. A process can also be affected by the material used. For example, changes in a raw material can cause changes in the process. Equipment can also affect a process. For example, when a pump or compressor malfunctions, variation can occur. Another factor that can affect a process is the environment. For example, an increase or a decrease in ambient temperature could affect the cooling capacity at a certain step in a process. The requirements of the end product can also affect a process. For example, if the requirements become more restrictive, it may become harder to produce a product that meets those requirements. SPC takes into consideration that some variation will always occur in a process, and it breaks variation down into two categories: random or normal variation, and special or abnormal variation. Normal variation occurs randomly and naturally in a process. Abnormal variation is sometimes referred to as assignable variation, since it can be assigned to a specific cause or problem. This is an XY graph. To understand how to plot process data on a control chart, it's helpful to start by reviewing how to plot values on a simple XY graph. On this graph, the horizontal line is called the x-axis, and the vertical line is referred to as the y-axis. The point where the two lines intersect is often the 0 point for both axes. Values are plotted on a graph to provide a visual representation of those values. Such a representation can reveal relationships between the values and, in some cases, indicate tendencies. One way to plot values on an XY graph is to start by finding the appropriate value on the x-axis. We'll use an x value of 2. At that point, an imaginary line is drawn perpendicular to the x-axis. Next, the appropriate value for y is located on the y-axis. In this case, we'll say it's 4. An imaginary line is then drawn perpendicular to the y-axis at that point. The point where the two imaginary lines cross is the value represented by 2 on the x-axis and 4 on the y-axis. When several values are plotted on the graph and connected by a line, we can get a better understanding of how the plotted values are related. For example, in this case, as the value of x increases, we see that the value of y increases at first, then drops off sharply. With lines connecting the plotted points, the peak that's formed is easier to see. This is a histogram. A histogram is basically a bar chart used to graphically display sample data. A histogram has an x-axis, which is used to represent some characteristic of the sample data, such as temperature, pressure, or weight. A histogram also has a y-axis, which is used to record the frequency with which the readings of the characteristic on the x-axis occurred. Data is plotted on a histogram in the form of bars or rectangles. These bars are called cells. A cell's height is related to the number of readings for the cell. Each cell has a starting point and an ending point. The distance between the starting point and the ending point of a cell is called the cell range. When we place some values on the axes, we can use this histogram to get a better understanding of the information that's provided. This particular histogram was developed from 115 temperature readings taken from a process fluid. The x-axis displays temperatures. It is divided into 10-degree increments, ranging from 70 degrees to 140 degrees. The y-axis displays the number of readings. It ranges from 0 to 25. As you can see, the starting point for the first cell is a temperature of 70 degrees, and the ending point is 80 degrees. so the cell has a range of 10. By looking at the value on the y-axis that corresponds to the top of the first cell, we see that 10 of the 115 readings fell within the range of 70 to 80 degrees. Now let's look at the fourth cell on the histogram. 25 of the readings fell in this cell, which is between 100 and 110 degrees. As the histogram indicates, the majority of the temperature readings fall within the cells located in the center of the histogram. The number of readings tapers off on each side of the center cells. This pattern is typical of any histogram that's plotted with data from a process in which only normal variation occurs. This histogram has taken the shape of a curve. This same shaped curve will appear on any histogram for a process where only normal variation occurs. This curve can be referred to as a bell curve or a normal distribution curve. A normal distribution curve represents the natural variation that occurs in all processes, and it is the basis for SPC control charts. The center of the normal distribution curve represents the mean value or average of the data being plotted. The downward slope of a normal distribution curve is the same on each side of the mean value line. This means that there are basically as many data points to the left of the average as there are to the right of it. In general, the farther from the average you go, the fewer temperature readings there are. A measure of the way data points are distributed within a normal distribution is called standard deviation. Within a normal distribution, around 68% of the plotted values should fall within a certain distance of the mean value. Here, two lines, one on each side of the mean value, represent the boundaries of that area. The distance from the mean value to each line is known as one standard deviation. Farther from the mean value are the lines for two standard deviations. About 95% of the readings should fall between these two lines. Still farther from the mean value are the lines for three standard deviations. Of all the readings taken, about 99.7% should fall between these two lines. The three standard deviation lines are commonly used as control limits on SPC control charts. This is a typical Shewhart control chart. There are several that are used in SPC. This control chart's x-axis represents how frequently samples are taken from the process. This can be in time intervals, such as every hour, or in quantity intervals, such as every so many samples. The chart's y-axis represents the values from the process. Like all control charts, this one has a process center line. The center line represents the same thing that the mean value line on a normal distribution curve represents: the average value for the variation that occurs in the process under normal conditions. A normal distribution curve is typically plotted so that the mean value line is vertical, but a Shewhart control chart is plotted with the process center line horizontal. So, in order to see the relationship between a normal distribution curve and a control chart, we'll turn the normal distribution curve on its side. As we just said, the mean value line on the normal distribution curve matches the process center line on the control chart. Also, the control chart has an upper control limit and a lower control limit. These control limits are established for a process based on information collected from the process. In this example, each limit is set at 3 standard deviations from the process center line. So they correspond to the lines for 3 standard deviations on the normal distribution curve. As with the normal distribution curve, some control charts provide further divisions between the lines representing 3 standard deviations. The lines for 1 standard deviation are located here and here on each side of the process center line. If you collected samples from a process that had only normal variation occurring in it, about 68% of the sample values should fall within the area between the lines for 1 standard deviation. The lines for 2 standard deviations are here and here. About 95% of the sample values should fall within 2 standard deviations of the process center line. The area between the upper and lower control limits, or the lines for 3 standard deviations, represents about 99.7% of all random occurrences. Now, there's a remote chance that a point could fall outside of the upper or lower limit when only normal variation is present in the process. But keep in mind that the chance of that occurring is very slim. So, for all intents and purposes, whenever a process is occurring with normal variation alone, basically every point that's plotted on the control chart should fall between the upper and lower control limits. When this occurs, the process is said to be in statistical control. If a point falls outside of the upper or lower control limit, it could be an indication that something is causing the process to be out of statistical control. This would be an indication of an abnormal or assignable variation. This is an XY graph. To understand how to plot process data on a control chart, it's helpful to start by reviewing how to plot values on a simple XY graph. On this graph, the horizontal line is called the x-axis, and the vertical line is referred to as the y-axis. The point where the two lines intersect is often the 0 point for both axes. This is a histogram. A histogram is basically a bar chart used to graphically display sample data. A histogram has an x-axis, which is used to represent some characteristic of the sample data, such as temperature, pressure, or weight. A histogram also has a y-axis, which is used to record the frequency with which the readings of the characteristic on the x-axis occurred. Data is plotted on a histogram in the form of bars or rectangles. These bars are called cells. A cell's height is related to the number of readings for the cell. A typical control chart has an upper control limit and a lower control limit. These control limits are established for a process based on information collected from the process. Each limit is usually set at 3 standard deviations from the process center line.